The strangest moments in life never announce themselves. They simply arrive disguised as ordinary accidents. I used to believe my life had already settled into the quiet routine it would follow forever. At 42, I owned a small independent bookstore in downtown Boston, lived alone in a brick townhouse filled with far too many books, and had convinced myself that peaceful predictability was enough. After my divorce 3 years earlier, I stopped expecting surprises. I stopped believing that destiny had anything left to offer me. My customers often joked that I knew every novel on my shelves better than I knew my own neighbors, and perhaps they were right. Stories had become easier than people. Characters rarely disappointed you. Real life usually did. That Friday morning began exactly like hundreds before it. I unlocked the bookstore at 8 o'clock, brewed a fresh pot of coffee, arranged a display of historical fiction near the front window, and spent the afternoon recommending novels to tourists escaping an unexpected spring shower. Nothing suggested the day would become unforgettable. Around 4 o'clock, my friend Melissa called with the determination only lifelong friends seem to possess. "You're still coming tonight," she declared before I could even say hello. "Melissa, I already told you I am not the right person for fancy charity galas." She laughed. "It is not about fancy people. The museum is raising money for literacy programs, and your bookstore helped sponsor the event. You deserve to be there." I glanced around the quiet store. "I would rather spend the evening reorganizing biographies." "That is exactly why you need to come." Before hanging up, she added one final sentence. "Sometimes the best chapters begin when we least want to turn the page." 2 hours later, I stood inside the marble entrance hall of the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, wearing the navy blue dress I had almost talked myself out of buying months earlier. Crystal chandeliers reflected across polished stone floors while a string quartet played softly beneath towering ceilings. Guests carried sparkling water and elegant appetizers while conversations floated through the room. With effortless confidence, I felt completely out of place. People like me belonged behind bookstore counters, not among philanthropists, diplomats, and distinguished guests whose names appeared in newspapers. I quietly accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing server and searched for the least intimidating corner of the room. That was when someone stepped backward at exactly the wrong moment. My glass slipped from my hand. Cold, sparkling water splashed across the front of another woman's cream-colored jacket before either of us had time to react. My heart nearly stopped. "Oh my goodness," I gasped, reaching instinctively for the napkins on a nearby table. "I am so incredibly sorry." She looked down at the wet fabric for only a second before lifting her eyes toward me. Instead of irritation, I found gentle amusement. She accepted the napkins with a quiet smile that somehow erased my panic almost instantly. "Well," she said softly, "I suppose that is one way to make sure I remember meeting someone." I could not help laughing despite my embarrassment. "I promise this is not my usual introduction." "That is disappointing," she replied with playful warmth. I was beginning to think it was wonderfully original. We stood there together blotting sparkling water from her jacket, while the gala continued around us, as though nothing unusual had happened. She appeared to be in her early 30s, with warm hazel eyes, light brown hair resting neatly against her shoulders, and a calm confidence that never felt intimidating. She looked elegant without seeming distant, graceful without appearing rehearsed. There was something unexpectedly comforting about the way she smiled, as though she genuinely enjoyed putting nervous strangers at ease. "I am Evelyn," I finally managed to say. She extended her hand naturally, her smile never fading. "Charlotte, it is very nice to meet you, Evelyn." Neither of us noticed the small group of formally dressed security officers watching discreetly from the opposite side of the room, and neither of us realized that within the next few minutes, one simple announcement would transform this ordinary conversation into the beginning of a story I could never have imagined. For a few peaceful minutes, Charlotte and I continued talking as though we had known each other much longer than the few moments since I had accidentally spilled sparkling water on her jacket. We laughed about my terrible luck at formal events, compared favorite novels, and discovered we both believed that independent bookstores possessed a kind of quiet magic chain stores could never replace. She listened with genuine curiosity whenever I described life inside my little bookstore, asking thoughtful questions about customers, rare editions, and why I still preferred handwritten recommendation cards instead of digital displays. I found myself relaxing in a way I had not expected. There was no trace of arrogance or superiority in her voice. If anything, she seemed grateful that our conversation revolved around ordinary things instead of social status or impressive accomplishments. Just as I was about to ask what she did for a living, the soft music inside the ballroom gradually faded. A member of the museum board stepped onto the stage, smiling toward the crowd gathered beneath the crystal chandeliers. Conversation slowly came to a stop as guests turned their attention forward. Charlotte glanced toward the stage with an expression I could not quite understand. It was calm, yet there was something almost resigned hidden beneath it. "Looks like the speeches are starting," I said. She nodded politely. "Yes. They usually do eventually." Before I had time to wonder what she meant, the Master of Ceremonies welcomed everyone and thanked the organization supporting the evening's literacy initiative. Then his tone became noticeably more formal. "Ladies and gentlemen, it is our tremendous honor to welcome Her Royal Highness, Princess Charlotte Ashford, whose foundation has become an international leader in expanding children's access to education and public libraries." The room erupted into warm applause. My smile disappeared almost instantly. I slowly turned toward the woman standing beside me. She offered an almost apologetic smile before letting out a quiet breath. "I was hoping we could finish talking before that part happened," she admitted softly. For several seconds, I simply stared at her. "Princess?" I asked, certain I had misunderstood something. She nodded once. "I know it sounds strange." I looked around as several discreet security officers approached from a respectful distance, clearly waiting for her to join the receiving line near the stage. Everything suddenly made sense. The elegant confidence, the subtle security presence I had barely noticed earlier, the way other guests occasionally glanced in her direction without approaching. I felt my face grow warm with embarrassment. "I spilled sparkling water on a princess," I whispered to myself. Charlotte laughed quietly, covering her smile for a moment. "You spilled sparkling water on Charlotte. That feels like an important distinction. To me, it is the only one that matters." Before I could answer, one of the security officers stepped forward with professional courtesy. "Your Royal Highness, they are ready for your remarks." Charlotte thanked him with a gracious nod before turning back toward me. "I suppose duty is calling." I immediately stepped aside. "Of course. I am so sorry. I had no idea." She tilted her head slightly. "May I ask you a favor?" "Anything." "Please do not let the title change the conversation we were having." I hesitated. "I am not sure that is possible." "I hope it is." Her smile remained warm, but I noticed something unexpectedly vulnerable in her eyes. It gets lonely when people stop seeing the person and only see the title. With that, she walked toward the stage as cameras quietly turned in her direction and the audience welcomed her with another round of applause. I remained near the back of the ballroom, still holding the empty glass that had somehow started this impossible evening. As Charlotte began speaking about literacy, community, and the power of books to change lives, I realized the woman standing beneath the spotlight sounded exactly like the one I had met beside the refreshment table. The only difference was that now everyone else finally knew who she was. For reasons I could not explain, I found myself wishing I had met Charlotte in my bookstore instead of a ballroom because, somewhere between one accidental spill and one extraordinary announcement, I had already forgotten I was supposed to treat her differently. The applause following Charlotte's speech lasted far longer than the speech itself. Guests lined up to greet her, museum directors waited to introduce themselves, photographers quietly documented every handshake, and members of the press gathered near the stage with carefully prepared questions. I watched the entire scene from the back of the ballroom, wondering how one conversation could suddenly feel so impossible simply because I had learned someone else's title. The woman who had laughed with me beside the refreshments now seemed surrounded by invisible walls built from protocol, expectation, and endless attention. I slipped toward the coat check, convinced our brief encounter had ended exactly where it should. People like Charlotte lived in a world that barely touched mine. By the time I stepped outside the museum, cool evening air greeted me with welcome relief. Boston's streets glistened beneath recent rain, and the city lights reflected across the sidewalks as taxis passed one after another. I had barely taken 10 steps when I heard someone call my name. Evelyn. I turned around in surprise. Charlotte was walking toward me, with only one security officer following several yards behind. She had exchanged the formal expression she wore on stage for the same relaxed smile I remembered from earlier. "I was hoping you had not left yet," she said. "I assumed you would still be surrounded by important people." She smiled gently. "That is exactly why I came outside." We began walking slowly along the museum entrance, where decorative lights illuminated rows of flowering trees. The security officer remained far enough away to give us privacy, without losing sight of her. "I wanted to apologize," Charlotte said after a moment. "For what?" "For not telling you who I was." I shook my head. "You did not owe me an explanation." "Maybe not." She looked toward the quiet street before continuing. "But I enjoyed talking to someone who only saw Charlotte. I was afraid the conversation would change the moment you heard the announcement." I laughed softly. "It definitely surprised me." I noticed. We both smiled. The awkwardness that I expected never really arrived. Instead, the conversation found its way back to books, travel, and favorite places to spend quiet afternoons. She admitted that whenever official visits brought her to American cities, she always searched for independent bookstores before visiting famous landmarks. "Bookstores are one of the few places where nobody expects anything from me," she explained. "People usually just recommend novels." That sounds much better than diplomatic receptions. Infinitely better. Before either of us realized it, nearly 20 minutes had passed. One of her staff members approached politely. "Your Royal Highness, the motorcade is ready." Charlotte nodded before turning back to me. "May I ask you one more question?" "Of course." "Would you mind telling me the name of your bookstore?" I hesitated. "You are not planning another official visit, are you?" She laughed.
No speeches. No cameras.
I was thinking more along the lines of buying a good book. I smiled despite myself. "Harbor Pages. It is about 15 minutes from here." She repeated the name quietly, committing it to memory. "I have a feeling I will remember that." We exchanged a warm goodbye before she stepped into the waiting car. I stood there watching the motorcade disappear into the evening traffic, still convinced that our paths were unlikely to cross again. 3 days later, on a calm Tuesday afternoon, I was arranging a display of classic American literature when the small bell above the bookstore door rang. Without looking up, I greeted the customer the way I always did. "Welcome to Harbor Pages. Let me know if I can help you find anything." A familiar voice answered almost immediately. "Actually, I was hoping you could help me find a place where nobody cares whether I am a princess." I looked up from the bookshelf, and there she was, standing alone in a simple cream sweater and blue jeans, carrying no royal formality except the warmth in her smile. Somehow, inside my little bookstore, she looked even more like the woman I had met before the announcement than the princess the rest of the world believed they knew. Charlotte stepped inside Harbor Pages as though she had been visiting independent bookstores her entire life instead of attending royal engagements around the world. She paused just beyond the entrance, slowly taking in the tall wooden shelves, the handwritten recommendation cards tucked beneath each featured novel, and the quiet sound of soft jazz drifting through the speakers overhead. A few customers glanced toward her before returning to their books, apparently seeing nothing more than another woman escaping into a bookstore on a peaceful Tuesday afternoon. She let out a barely noticeable sigh of relief. "I think this might be my favorite room in Boston," she said. I smiled as I walked around the counter. "You have only been here for about 30 seconds. Sometimes that is enough." She ran her fingertips lightly across the spine of a hardcover classic before looking back at me. Places like this remind people to slow down. We wandered through the aisles together while I recommended novels that rarely appeared on bestseller lists, but somehow stayed with readers for years. Charlotte listened with genuine curiosity, occasionally pulling a book from the shelf to read the opening paragraph before placing it carefully into a growing stack she intended to buy. Every conversation felt remarkably ordinary, and I slowly realized that was exactly what she had been searching for. She did not want anyone asking about royal ceremonies or official speeches. She wanted someone willing to debate favorite authors and argue about whether the ending of a novel had truly been satisfying. Around lunchtime, the bookstore became quieter as the morning customers drifted away. Charlotte glanced toward the small reading corner beside the front window where two comfortable chairs overlooked the tree-lined street. "May I ask something slightly selfish?" she said. "Go ahead. Would it be terribly inappropriate if I stayed here for another hour and read?" I laughed softly. "Charlotte, bookstores survive because people stay longer than they planned." Her smile widened with obvious relief. "That is wonderful news." I prepared a fresh pot of coffee for the complimentary refreshment table while she settled into one of the reading chairs with a novel resting comfortably in her lap. Every few minutes, she looked up to watch people quietly browsing the shelves, and each time I caught her smiling to herself. It was the expression of someone discovering a kind of freedom most people never realized they already possessed. Later that afternoon, after purchasing an armful of books, Charlotte helped me straighten a display that had been accidentally disturbed by an energetic child searching for adventure stories. I raised an eyebrow with playful amusement. "I am fairly certain princesses are not expected to reorganize bookstores." She laughed while placing another novel neatly onto the shelf. "Perhaps not, but Charlotte enjoys it." Before I could answer, my friend Melissa stepped through the front door carrying a delivery box for the store. She froze the instant she recognized our customer. Her eyes moved from Charlotte to me and back again with unmistakable disbelief. "Evelyn," she whispered after setting the box down, "do you realize you have a princess shelving books?" I felt my face warm immediately. Charlotte simply smiled and extended her hand with effortless grace. "Hello, I am Charlotte." Melissa shook her hand slowly, still trying to process what she was seeing. After a few polite introductions, she disappeared into the stockroom, though I had no doubt she would ask me 100 questions later. Charlotte watched her leave before looking back at me with amused eyes. "I suppose keeping a low profile only works for so long." I smiled. "Probably." She gathered her books into a canvas tote before walking toward the register. As I rang up the purchase, she hesitated for just a moment. "I will be in Boston for several more weeks working with a literacy foundation," she said. "They're planning a community library project, and I wondered whether someone who loves books as much as you do might be willing to help." I looked at the stack of novels, then back at the hopeful expression on her face. Somewhere deep inside, I already knew that saying yes to a library project might quietly become the beginning of something far more important than either of us was prepared to admit. I agreed to help before my practical side had enough time to list all the reasons I probably should not. Charlotte's invitation sounded simple on the surface. The Literacy Foundation was partnering with local schools and community organizations to transform an unused neighborhood building into a welcoming public library, and they wanted someone with experience selecting books, organizing collections, and creating spaces that encouraged people to fall in love with reading. Everything about the project aligned perfectly with the life I had built around Harbor Pages. The only complication was the woman standing in front of me. "You do not have to decide today," Charlotte said gently, noticing my hesitation. "I know running a bookstore already keeps you busy." I smiled. "You make it very difficult to say no." She laughed softly. "That was not my intention." "I believe you." After glancing around my quiet bookstore, I finally nodded. "All right, I will help." The warmth that crossed her face made the decision feel worthwhile almost immediately. "Thank you, Evelyn. I think this project will be much better because of you." 2 days later, I arrived at the old brick building that would soon become the neighborhood library. Sunlight streamed through tall windows coated with years of dust, revealing rows of empty shelves waiting to be filled with stories. Volunteers carried paint supplies, folding tables, and boxes of donated books through the wide entrance, while local teachers discussed reading programs for children. The building looked unfinished, but there was already something hopeful about it. Charlotte greeted every volunteer by name before walking over to me with a clipboard tucked beneath one arm. She wore dark blue jeans, comfortable walking shoes, and a light cream sweater instead of anything formal. Without the expectations that surrounded official appearances, she blended naturally into the busy crowd. "Welcome to our newest adventure," she said with an enthusiastic smile. "I think adventure is the correct word," I replied while looking around the enormous room. "There's a lot to do." Fortunately, there are many hands willing to help. Throughout the morning, we sorted hundreds of donated books into broad categories before discussing which shelves would be most inviting for children, teenagers, and adult readers. Charlotte listened carefully whenever I explained why certain books naturally belonged together, or how the first display people saw often determined whether they continued exploring the library. She asked thoughtful questions, took notes, and never pretended to know more than she did. More than once I caught myself forgetting she was a princess at all. She simply felt like another volunteer who genuinely cared about creating something meaningful. Around lunchtime, we walked together to a nearby neighborhood cafe where volunteers gathered around several pushed-together tables. No photographers followed us inside. No formal introductions interrupted the meal. We shared homemade soup, fresh sandwiches, and quiet conversation while discussing favorite childhood books. Charlotte admitted that the first novel she ever loved had been borrowed secretly from a palace library because everyone insisted she was still too young to read it. "Did you get caught?" I asked with a smile. "Eventually," she admitted with playful embarrassment. Fortunately, my grandmother believed every child deserved at least one unforgettable reading adventure. I laughed, imagining a young princess hiding beneath blankets with a flashlight and a forbidden novel. The picture felt wonderfully ordinary. As we returned to the library that afternoon, I noticed several people across the street quietly taking photographs with their phones. Charlotte saw them too, but her expression remained calm. She simply continued walking beside me as though she had learned long ago that attention was something she could acknowledge without allowing it to control her. Watching her handle that constant public interest with quiet grace made me admire her even more. By the end of the day, the empty building had already begun resembling a real library, and somewhere between arranging bookshelves and sharing stories over lunch, I realized I had started looking forward to seeing Charlotte for reasons that had very little to do with the project itself. That realization arrived as quietly as everything important seemed to whenever she was nearby, leaving me with the unmistakable feeling that the most meaningful chapters of this journey had only just begun. Over the following 2 weeks, the library project gradually became part of my routine in ways I had never expected. Every morning I opened Harbor Pages, spent several hours helping customers discover new books, and every afternoon I drove across the city to the old brick building where shelves slowly filled with stories instead of dust. What surprised me most was not how quickly the library transformed. It was how naturally Charlotte became part of my everyday life. We spent hours sorting novels, discussing reading programs, measuring shelf space, and debating whether the children's corner should greet visitors immediately at the entrance or remain tucked into a quieter section of the building. We rarely agreed at first, but somehow every disagreement ended with laughter instead of frustration. One afternoon, she insisted the young adult section should be placed beside the large front windows because teenagers deserved beautiful places to read. I argued that families with small children would appreciate those windows even more. After 20 minutes of playful debate, we compromised by redesigning the entire floor plan together. "You negotiate surprisingly well," I teased while moving another bookshelf a few feet to the left. Charlotte smiled as she adjusted a stack of picture books. Years of diplomatic meetings finally proved useful. "I thought princesses always got exactly what they wanted." She laughed. "That may be one of the least accurate stories ever written about royalty." As the days passed, I began noticing the small details that never appeared in newspapers. Charlotte always remembered every volunteer's name after meeting them only once. She quietly stayed after everyone else left to sweep the floors or carry empty boxes without asking anyone else to do it. Whenever children visited the unfinished library with their teachers, she knelt to speak at eye level instead of towering over them. She treated every person with the same calm respect, whether they were donors, construction workers, teachers, or first graders proudly carrying their favorite books. Watching those quiet moments changed something inside me. One rainy afternoon, The volunteers took shelter inside while thunder rolled gently across the sky outside. We gathered around folding tables with coffee, sandwiches, and homemade cookies donated by a neighborhood bakery. The relaxed atmosphere encouraged conversations that had nothing to do with construction schedules or library budgets. Someone asked Charlotte what surprised her most about spending several weeks in Boston. She looked around the room before answering. How quickly ordinary moments become extraordinary when nobody expects anything from you except honesty. The room grew unexpectedly quiet. One of the teachers smiled warmly. You make that sound like a rare gift. Charlotte nodded.
For me, it is.
Later that afternoon, after the volunteers headed home, I stayed behind to finish organizing donated biographies. Charlotte joined me, carefully placing books onto freshly labeled shelves. The rain continued tapping softly against the tall windows while the nearly completed library felt peaceful in a way unfinished buildings rarely do. May I tell you something without sounding ungrateful? She asked. I looked over. Of course. She rested one hand lightly on the edge of the bookshelf before speaking. People spend most of their lives trying to meet a princess. She smiled sadly. I spend much of mine hoping someone will forget I am one. I stood quietly for a moment, letting her words settle between us. I think I understand that better now than I did the night we met. She looked at me with gentle curiosity. Do you? I nodded. Because every afternoon I spend here, I remember Charlotte long before I remember the title everyone else uses. Her expression softened in a way I had never seen before. She did not answer immediately. Instead, she smiled with quiet gratitude, and somehow that simple smile carried more meaning than any royal speech ever could. As we locked the library doors together beneath clearing evening skies, I realized the greatest distance between us had never been measured by oceans, countries, or royal traditions. It had been measured by how long it took two ordinary hearts to believe they could meet on equal ground. The following Monday morning, I unlocked Harbor Pages with the same familiar routine I had repeated for years, yet everything around me felt subtly different. The shelves were exactly where they had always been. The scent of fresh coffee drifted through the bookstore just as it did every morning. Customers wandered quietly through the aisles searching for new stories. Nothing had changed except me. Somewhere between organizing library shelves with Charlotte and sharing ordinary conversations over coffee and sandwiches, I had begun looking forward to every afternoon in a way I had not experienced since before my marriage ended. That realization should have been comforting. Instead, it left me wondering whether I was walking toward happiness or another heartbreak. Around noon, Melissa arrived carrying 2 takeaway coffees and the knowing smile she always wore whenever she believed she had figured something out before I had. She leaned against the front counter and studied me for a moment. You smile more these days, she observed. I tried to sound casual. The library project has been rewarding. That is not what I meant. I busied myself straightening a stack of new arrivals. I do not know what you're talking about. Melissa laughed softly. Evelyn, I have known you for 15 years. You only reorganize books alphabetically when you are trying not to think about something. I looked down at the novels in front of me before quietly admitting, she is different. Melissa's expression softened immediately. I can already tell. Before I could say anything else, my phone vibrated with a message from Charlotte. It was short, simple, and completely ordinary. The first shipment of children's books just arrived. I thought you would want to see them before we start organizing this afternoon. I smiled before realizing Melissa was watching me. There it is, she said gently. That look. What look? The one that says someone has quietly become important. I slipped the phone into my pocket without answering. She is a princess, Melissa. She is also a person. I did not respond because I already knew she was right. Later that afternoon, I arrived at the library to find dozens of colorful boxes stacked across the entrance hall. Charlotte was kneeling beside a group of elementary school volunteers, helping them unpack picture books while listening carefully as each child explained why their favorite story deserved the best shelf. She looked up as I walked in, and her face brightened with the same genuine smile that somehow greeted me every single day. Perfect timing, she said. I saved the classics for you. We spent hours arranging books while children eagerly debated which stories belonged together. Watching Charlotte patiently encourage every young volunteer reminded me once again that kindness was never something she performed for cameras. It simply seemed to be part of who she was. As the afternoon came to an end and the last volunteer headed home, a black sedan quietly pulled up outside the building. Moments later, a distinguished woman in an elegant charcoal suit entered accompanied by 2 members of Charlotte's staff. The room grew noticeably quieter. Charlotte's smile faded almost imperceptibly. "Good afternoon, Your Royal Highness," the woman said formally. "I am afraid we need to discuss tomorrow's schedule." Charlotte introduced us politely. "Evelyn, this is Margaret Ellison, my senior royal advisor." Margaret greeted me with flawless courtesy, but her eyes lingered just long enough to suggest she had already noticed how naturally Charlotte and I worked together. She turned back toward Charlotte. "There's been increased media attention regarding your repeated visits here. Several outlets have begun asking questions." Charlotte remained calm. "We're building a library." "Yes," Margaret replied carefully. "But public perception rarely limits itself to facts." An uncomfortable silence settled over the room. I suddenly understood that the peaceful little world we had created inside this library existed only because the outside world had not fully stepped inside it yet.
Charlotte met my
eyes for a brief moment, offering a reassuring smile despite the concern quietly forming around us. For the first time since we met, I realized that the greatest obstacle between us might never be the distance we felt ourselves, but the expectations carried by everyone else. The conversation with Margaret lingered in my thoughts long after I drove home that evening. Every mile between the library and my bookstore seemed to reinforce the same uncomfortable truth. Until that moment, I had managed to forget that Charlotte's life belonged, in many ways, to the public. Inside the library, she was simply another volunteer carrying boxes of books and laughing with children. Outside those walls, every photograph, every conversation, and every ordinary moment could become tomorrow's headline. I unlocked Harbor Pages the next morning feeling unusually distracted. Customers noticed it before I did. I recommended the same mystery novel 3 times to 3 different people and accidentally shelved a biography in the travel section. Around noon, Melissa walked in carrying lunch as she often did during busy weeks. One look at me was enough for her to set the paper bag on the counter, without saying a word. "Something happened," she said gently. I nodded. Reality finally caught up with us. As we ate sandwiches in the small office behind the bookstore, I explained Margaret's visit and the concern about growing media attention. Melissa listened quietly before asking the one question I had been avoiding. "What are you really afraid of?" I looked down at my coffee cup. That I could become a problem she never asked for. Later that afternoon, I arrived at the library earlier than usual. Charlotte was already there reviewing plans for the grand opening with teachers and volunteers. The moment she saw me, her face brightened exactly as it always had, and for a brief second, all my worries disappeared. We spent the afternoon arranging reading corners, unpacking donated books, and helping local students decorate colorful welcome signs. Everything felt wonderfully familiar until one of the younger volunteers hurried inside holding a phone. "Someone posted pictures from yesterday," she said innocently. "People are talking about the princess and the bookstore owner working together." Charlotte accepted the phone calmly and glanced at the screen for only a moment before handing it back with a reassuring smile. "Thank you. Please do not worry about it." The volunteer returned to her project, unaware that she had quietly changed the atmosphere inside the room. After the children left, Charlotte and I continued labeling shelves in comfortable silence until I finally spoke. Margaret was right, was she not? Charlotte carefully placed another book on the shelf before answering. "She usually is. People are paying attention." "Yes." I took a slow breath. "I never wanted to make your life more complicated." She turned toward me with quiet patience. "Evelyn, my life was already complicated long before we met. That does not mean I should add to it." She studied my expression for a moment. "Are you asking whether we should stop working together?" I could not answer immediately because the truthful response hurt more than I expected. "I do not know," I admitted. I only know that every headline seems to make the distance between our worlds feel a little larger. Charlotte lowered the label she had been holding and stepped a little closer, her voice remaining calm. Do you know what I have learned after years of living in public? I shook my head. People will always create stories when they do not know the truth. I managed a faint smile. That sounds exhausting. Sometimes it is. She returned the smile with quiet warmth, which is why I try very hard to build my life around the people who know the truth instead. Her words stayed with me as we finished organizing the final shelves before closing the library for the evening. Yet when I climbed into my car and noticed another camera waiting across the street, I realized my heart had already begun making a decision my mind desperately wished it did not have to make. If stepping away could protect the peaceful life Charlotte deserved, I was no longer certain I had the right to stay as close to her as I wanted. The decision haunted me for 2 sleepless nights before I finally convinced myself it was the right thing to do. Every argument sounded reasonable when I repeated it often enough. Charlotte deserved peace. The library deserved to remain the focus of public attention instead of speculation. My ordinary life could absorb gossip much more easily than hers ever could. By Wednesday morning, those thoughts had become convincing enough that I believed them. I called the project coordinator before leaving for the bookstore and explained that I would still donate books, help organize shipments, and prepare reading lists from Harbor Pages, but I would no longer spend my afternoons at the library. The coordinator sounded disappointed, but understanding. I will let Princess Charlotte know, she said kindly. My heart sank the moment those words left her mouth. The bookstore felt unusually quiet that afternoon. Every customer who walked through the door reminded me of someone I wished would not appear. Around 3 o'clock, the little bell above the entrance rang again. I looked up instinctively, but it was only a delivery driver carrying another shipment of novels. I realized I had been hoping to see Charlotte before I had even admitted it to myself. She never came. She did not call. She did not ask why I had stepped away from the project. Somehow that hurt even more because it was exactly the kind of respect I had come to expect from her. If I had chosen distance, she would honor that choice even if she did not understand it. The following Saturday, the library hosted a preview event for local families before the official opening. I stayed away, telling myself I had already made my decision. Instead, I arranged a large display in the bookstore featuring children's classics and donated every dollar from those sales to the library project. It felt like the closest I could come without making things more difficult. Late that afternoon, Melissa walked into the store carrying her phone with a puzzled expression. "Have you seen this?" she asked. She placed the screen in front of me. It showed a photograph from the library event. Charlotte stood surrounded by smiling children holding newly borrowed books. The accompanying article praised the community volunteers who had helped transform the abandoned building into a welcoming library. I read the entire story twice. My name appeared only once, buried near the end in a short sentence thanking Harbor Pages for donating books and recommending reading collections. There was no gossip.
No rumors. No sensational headlines.
Nothing that resembled the disaster I had imagined. That is all. I asked quietly. Melissa nodded. Looks like people cared more about the children than the speculation. I stared at the photograph of Charlotte smiling beside the library entrance. Instead of relief, I felt regret. I had walked away to protect her from a problem that barely existed. Just before closing time, another delivery arrived. This time it was not books. A volunteer from the library handed me a carefully wrapped package with a small handwritten note attached. "Princess Charlotte asked me to bring this to you," she explained before leaving. I waited until the bookstore was empty before opening it. Inside was a first edition of one of my favorite classic novels, beautifully restored, with a bookmark tucked between the opening pages. Written neatly on the bookmark were only 2 sentences. "The library does not feel the same without your ideas. I hope you are taking good care of yourself." There was no guilt, no questions, no attempt to persuade me to return. She had simply found another quiet way to be kind. I held the bookmark for a long time, realizing that while I had been trying to protect Charlotte from imagined consequences, she had continued protecting my dignity without asking for anything in return. For the first time since stepping away from the project, I wondered whether the greatest mistake I had made was not allowing fear to change my future, but allowing it to change the way I trusted someone who had never once given me a reason to doubt her. The restored first edition remained on the corner of my desk for the next several days, unopened, yet impossible to ignore. Every time I walked past it inside Harbor pages, I found myself reading the handwritten note again. The words never changed, but somehow they carried a different meaning each time.
Charlotte had never asked me to return.
She had never questioned my decision or tried to convince me that I had been wrong. She had simply reminded me that kindness does not disappear simply because distance appears. That quiet grace made my absence feel heavier than ever. On Thursday morning, Richard, the president of the local booksellers association, stopped by the bookstore carrying an invitation printed on thick cream-colored paper. "The library grand opening is tomorrow afternoon," he said. "The foundation specifically requested that Harbor Pages attend the ribbon-cutting ceremony. You donated nearly a third of the opening collection. You should be there." I looked at the invitation without immediately accepting it. "I am not sure I belong." Richard frowned with genuine confusion. "Evelyn, you helped build that place from empty shelves. Why would you think you do not belong?" I smiled politely, but offered no explanation. That evening I drove past the nearly completed library on my way home. The building glowed warmly beneath the setting sun, every window illuminated from inside as volunteers prepared for the following day's celebration. I almost pulled into the parking lot more than once before continuing home. Fear still sounded surprisingly reasonable whenever I allowed it enough time to speak. The next afternoon arrived bright and unusually warm for early spring. I spent the morning helping customers, but my thoughts never stayed inside the bookstore for very long. Shortly after noon, Melissa walked in carrying 2 coffees and set one in front of me without saying a word. After a long silence, she finally asked, "If you do not go today, what story are you planning to tell yourself next year?" I looked at her without answering. "Will it be that you are protecting Charlotte?" she continued gently. "Or that you were protecting yourself from finding out how she truly felt?" Her question followed me long after she left. At 1:30, I locked the bookstore earlier than usual, placed a handwritten note on the front door explaining that Harbor Pages would reopen later in the afternoon, and started driving toward the library before I could change my mind. When I arrived, families already filled the courtyard. Children carried balloons decorated with colorful book illustrations, and local musicians played cheerful acoustic music near the entrance. The atmosphere felt joyful rather than formal. I quietly slipped into the crowd near the back, hoping to congratulate the volunteers without drawing attention to myself. Charlotte stood near the front entrance speaking with teachers, city officials, and community leaders. She looked elegant in a soft blue dress beneath a light cream coat, smiling warmly as she welcomed every guest. Then the ceremony began. The mayor thanked the volunteers, the teachers, and the local businesses that had contributed to the project. Finally, Charlotte stepped toward the microphone. "Libraries are never built by one person," she began. "They're built by communities willing to believe that stories can change lives." She paused briefly before continuing. "There is also someone I would like to thank personally. A bookstore owner reminded me that the best libraries are not measured by the number of books on their shelves, but by the number of people who feel welcome enough to return. Her kindness shaped this place more than she realizes." My heart stopped. She had never mentioned my name, yet somehow I knew exactly who she was talking about. So did Melissa, who quietly nudged my shoulder from somewhere beside me with an understanding smile. Charlotte's eyes slowly scanned the audience until they met mine near the back of the crowd. For just one brief moment, surrounded by hundreds of people celebrating the library we had helped create together, every sound seemed to disappear. The distance I had worked so hard to build no longer felt like protection. It felt like the only obstacle still standing between two people who had spent weeks choosing courage for everyone else except themselves. The applause slowly faded as families wandered deeper into the library. Children hurried toward colorful reading corners, and volunteers proudly showed visitors the shelves that had once stood empty only a few weeks earlier. I remained near the back of the building, watching everything from a distance while quietly wondering whether I should leave before anyone noticed I had come. Part of me still believed I had surrendered the right to stand there after walking away from the project. I had almost reached the side entrance when I heard familiar footsteps behind me. I was hoping you had not disappeared before I could find you. I turned and saw Charlotte standing a few feet away. She had slipped away from the crowd without ceremony, her blue dress partially hidden beneath a light cream coat, her expression warm yet undeniably relieved. For a moment neither of us spoke. The silence felt strangely familiar, like opening a favorite novel after setting it aside for too long. "Congratulations," I said at last. "You did it." Charlotte looked around the bright library filled with laughing children and smiling parents before gently shaking her head. "We did it." I smiled faintly. "I stopped helping before the end." "You helped build the beginning," she replied softly. That mattered just as much. Her kindness made the apology I had rehearsed all morning suddenly feel unavoidable. I took a slow breath. "Charlotte, I owe you the truth." She nodded once, saying nothing, giving me exactly the same patient space she had always offered whenever something difficult needed to be said. "I told myself I stepped away because I wanted to protect your reputation." I looked down briefly before meeting her eyes again. But that was only part of the story. She waited quietly. The larger truth is that I was frightened. I laughed softly at my own honesty. After my marriage ended, I spent years convincing myself that keeping people at a comfortable distance was the safest way to live. Then you walked into my bookstore asking for book recommendations, and without realizing it, I started looking forward to every conversation, every planning meeting, every afternoon at the library. I paused before continuing. When the cameras appeared and people started paying attention, I convinced myself that leaving first would hurt less than risking losing someone who had already become important to me. Charlotte's expression softened with quiet understanding rather than surprise. "May I tell you something?" she asked gently.
Of course.
She folded her hands comfortably in front of her before answering. "The day you stopped coming to the library, I walked past the history shelves 3 different times because I kept expecting to find you reorganizing them." I blinked, unable to hide my surprise. She smiled with gentle embarrassment. "Every afternoon I caught myself listening for the bookstore bell you once described because somehow I imagined I would hear it even inside the library." I felt my throat tighten. "You never called. Because you asked for distance without using those exact words." She looked directly into my eyes. "Caring about someone sometimes means respecting the decision they believe they need, even when you quietly wish they had made another one." I shook my head. "I made the wrong decision." "Maybe." She smiled warmly. "But you are here now." The simplicity of those 4 words settled deep inside me. There was no resentment in her voice, no list of mistakes, no demand that I explain every fear that had kept me away. There was only gratitude that I had come back. Sunlight poured through the library windows, casting long golden patterns across the polished floors while children laughed somewhere beyond the reading corner. I realized that every story filling these shelves had reached its hopeful ending because, at some point, someone inside those pages found the courage to stop running from what mattered most. Looking at Charlotte, I finally understood that courage rarely feels dramatic. Sometimes it is nothing more than telling the truth to the person whose opinion has quietly become the most important one in your world. When we finally returned inside the library, the celebration was beginning to wind down. Families slowly gathered their children, volunteers stacked empty boxes near the entrance, and the last guided tours ended with grateful smiles instead of formal applause. The building no longer felt like a construction project or a ceremonial event. It already felt like a place where people belonged. Charlotte and I quietly helped return chairs to their places and collected forgotten coloring pencils from the children's reading corner.
We worked side by side.
Without needing many words. Somehow the silence between us had become one of the safest places I had ever known. As we carried a box of donated bookmarks toward the information desk, Charlotte glanced at me with a thoughtful smile. "Do you remember the first time we met?" she asked. I laughed softly. "How could I forget? I spilled sparkling water on your jacket before I even knew your name." "You knew my name." She smiled playfully. "You just did not know the complicated part that came after it." I shook my head. Looking back, I think meeting you before learning your title was the greatest gift either of us could have received. She slowed her pace slightly.
Why?
Because I met Charlotte first. I looked at her warmly. The princess came later. She lowered her eyes for a brief moment before smiling with unmistakable gratitude. Thank you for saying that. A few minutes later, Margaret approached us, carrying a folder beneath one arm. I instinctively expected another formal conversation, but instead she offered me a sincere smile. Miss Brooks, I wanted to thank you for everything you contributed to this project. I nodded politely. It was truly an honor. Margaret looked toward the bright library filled with shelves we had organized together. Her Royal Highness speaks very highly of you. Before I could respond, she added something I did not expect. The happiest I have seen Charlotte in many years has been during these past few weeks. Charlotte looked slightly embarrassed. Margaret. The older woman smiled kindly. I believe honesty is appropriate on a day like today. She excused herself to greet another guest, leaving the two of us standing quietly together. I turned toward Charlotte with gentle curiosity. She surprised me. Charlotte laughed softly. She surprises people more often than they realize. We stepped outside once again as the evening sun painted the city in warm shades of gold. The courtyard had become almost empty, leaving only the gentle sound of the fountain and a cool spring breeze moving through the flowering trees. Charlotte rested one hand lightly against the stone railing overlooking the small garden. In a few days I will return. Home, she said quietly. The words settled between us more heavily than I expected. For how long? I will still travel back and forth for foundation projects. She looked at me with calm sincerity. But there will be an ocean between us more often than there is now. I nodded slowly, surprised that the thought hurt as much as it did. Long distance is not easy.
No.
She smiled gently. But I think honesty has already taught us something important. I looked at her. What is that? Distance becomes much smaller when neither person is running away anymore. I smiled, realizing she was right. We had already faced the hardest obstacle, and it had never been geography or royal responsibilities. It had been fear. I reached into my bag and carefully removed the restored first edition she had given me days earlier. Tucked inside was the handwritten bookmark she had included. I held it up with a quiet smile. I never thanked you properly for this. Charlotte looked at the bookmark before meeting my eyes again. You showing up today was thanks enough. Standing there beneath the soft evening light, I realized that love had not arrived in one dramatic moment. It had been quietly built through spilled, sparkling water, shared books, ordinary afternoons, patient forgiveness, and two women choosing to understand each other before asking to be understood. For the first time in years, the future no longer felt frightening. It simply felt unwritten, waiting patiently for us to begin the next chapter together. Several months passed with a quiet rhythm that somehow made every goodbye easier and every reunion more meaningful. Charlotte returned to Europe to continue her royal responsibilities, while I settled back into the familiar routines of Harbor Pages. Yet nothing truly returned to the way it had been before. Every Sunday evening we spoke for hours despite the time difference, sharing stories about ordinary days instead of extraordinary events. She told me about schools her foundation visited, children who proudly showed her their favorite books, and quiet mornings spent reading before official meetings began. I told her about new customers discovering forgotten classics, neighborhood book clubs that refused to end on time, and the library that had quickly become one of the busiest places in the city. Somehow the miles between us never seemed as overwhelming as they once had. We had already learned that honesty traveled much farther than fear ever could. Autumn returned almost without my noticing. One crisp October afternoon, I was arranging a display of classic novels near the front window when the familiar bell above the bookstore door rang. Without looking up, I smiled automatically. Welcome to Harbor Pages. No answer came immediately. Instead, I heard the quiet sound of footsteps moving slowly across the wooden floor I had walked every day for years. When I finally looked up, my heart forgot every sensible thing it had ever known. Charlotte stood just inside the entrance wearing a cream-colored coat, a soft blue sweater, and the same warm smile that had first greeted me after I spilled sparkling water across her jacket months earlier. There were no television cameras waiting outside, no formal announcement, and no line of officials surrounding her. Only one discreet security officer remained respectfully near the door, allowing her the simple freedom to walk through the bookstore exactly the way she always wanted. I laughed softly, almost unable to believe she was really there. "You did not tell me you were coming." She stepped closer with unmistakable happiness shining across her face. "I wanted this visit to be a surprise." I walked around the counter before stopping in front of her. "That may be the best surprise anyone has ever given me." She looked around the bookstore with familiar affection before meeting my eyes again. "I had a free week before my next foundation project." She smiled. There was only one place I wanted to spend the first afternoon. We wandered through the bookstore exactly as we had the first time she visited, discussing new arrivals, recommending favorite authors, and laughing over books we both insisted everyone should read at least once. Nothing felt forced. Nothing felt complicated. The differences that had once seemed impossible had quietly become part of the background instead of the center of our story. Later that evening, after closing the bookstore, we carried 2 cups of coffee to the small park overlooking Boston Harbor where autumn leaves drifted gently across the path beside us. The sunset painted the water in brilliant shades of gold and amber, while sailboats moved peacefully across the harbor. Charlotte looked toward the horizon before turning to me. "Do you remember what you told me inside the library?" she asked. I smiled. "Which part?" "You said the future felt unwritten." I nodded. "It still does." She reached into her coat pocket and carefully removed a simple silver bookmark engraved with a small open book. She placed it gently into my hand. "Then let us promise to keep writing it together." I looked at the bookmark before meeting her eyes again. There was nothing extravagant about the gift, yet it somehow carried everything that mattered. It represented stories, patience, second chances, and every ordinary moment that had slowly become extraordinary simply because we chose to share them. Looking back now, people sometimes ask me what it was really like to fall in love with a princess. They expect stories about palaces, ceremonies, and impossible fairy tales. The truth always makes them smile. I did not fall in love with a title. I fell in love with a woman who found peace inside a quiet bookstore, believed that libraries could change lives, laughed after someone accidentally spilled sparkling water on her jacket, and reminded me that the greatest love stories are never about royalty at all. They are about 2 ordinary hearts finding each other when neither one expected another beautiful chapter was still waiting to be written.